Thanks, Jen. Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Schedule of Cost Components. So if we can just move to the next slide, Jen. So anyone who came along to the webinar last month or came to one of the in-person seminars up in Gateshead or at Walshford last month will know that we covered compensation events, and I said it was a kind of first part of a two-part series within the whole series this year. So this is the second part, the schedule of cost components. So we looked at how to claim a compensation event. So what we're going to look at today is schedule of cost components. So I think the first slide last month was compensation events. Is this the trickiest part of NEC? I think from my perspective, the question here is schedule of cost components. Is this the dullest part of NEC? That might be controversial, though. We will see. I think to an extent it is. There's a lot of detail in it. So I'm kind of trying today to explain where it fits in for different contracts, how it works with other parts of the contract, and then finally cover the detail but at a high level. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Jen. So, and again, we're kind of circling round. We're not actually looking at the schedule or shorter schedule yet. But what we're looking at is when do we use either of the schedules? So first of all, looking at the schedule. Now, as you might have gathered, the difference between the schedule and the shorter schedule is that the shorter schedule is shorter. I think the shorter schedule is about 2 pages compared to the schedule 3 pages. However, if you look at the guidance notes are about 5 pages for one and about 3 or 4 for the shorter schedule, which I think says quite a lot if it takes more pages to explain the contract than are in the contract itself. So the schedule of cost components, when is it used? Well, first of all, it's used for those NEC contracts C, D and E. So what are they? Well, E is your reimbursable, and C and D are your kind of pain gain profit sharing contracts. So where are they used? Well, they're used in each of your interim payment applications as you go through the project. So typically that will be every 28 days or monthly. This is where the schedule of cost components comes in. So it's really, really relevant on options C, D and E. How does it fit in? Well, the schedule of cost components is part of the defined cost. Now, defined cost, capital D and C, because it's a defined term in the contract. So effectively, defined cost includes items in the schedule of cost components and subcontractor costs. So under NEC 3, subcontractor is dealt with within defined cost. In NEC 4, it's actually the subcontractor costs are included in the schedule of cost components itself, which I think is helpful because it kind of moves it all to one place and kind of avoids the risk that a junior QS might inadvertently miss the subcontractor costs simply because it's not in the schedule of cost components. It's just so we know the context. So defined cost is the cost that is applied for in interim payment applications by the contractor or subcontractor and the basis upon which those payments are assessed. So it's important in terms of payments. So that's both cash flow and, ultimate sums that are paid in respect of the project. Disallowed cost is deducted from the defined cost. Disallowed cost, in very broad terms, are things that you wouldn't really, as a contractor or subcontractor, expect to be able to claim. So adjudication costs are included. We all, each party bears their own adjudication costs, but it also means that, you know, in elements where, for example, a contractor's not working efficiently or is double counting for claims, you know, disallowed cost entitles the paying party to deduct such items. So none of them are massively controversial. So high level, the aim of the schedule of cost components is to set out the actual cost that contractor or subcontractor business pays in regard to all the things it pays for. So it's staff, it's subcontractors, it's plant, it's equipment, etc. So, you know, if you're thinking with your business head on, what's missing from that? Well, critically, there's no overhead included in that, and there's no profit. So that's where the final bullet point here comes in, because we have our fee percentage, the contractor's fee and the subcontractor's fee. So when you have all the items added up from the schedule of cost components, you then add on the fee percentage, which covers the overhead and the profit and a few other bits and pieces, which we'll see later on. So if we can have the next slide, please. So this is moving on to the shorter schedule of cost components. So we know it's shorter. So where is this used? Well, it's predominantly used for options A and B. So they're the fixed, the lump sum contracts. So obviously you get paid your fixed price, your lump sum in those contracts, but the shorter schedule is used to calculate your compensation events. So again, really important, probably not quite as important as for the options C, D and E, but in my experience, quite often projects have huge numbers of compensation events. And of course, you know, without the ability to claim for them, you know, projects are going to go awry in most cases. So still important. There are other alternatives where you can also use the shorter schedules. The first one is the second bullet point. If the project manager and contractor agree between them that it should be used for the contracts C, D and E for maybe one item, or if they, you know, agree generally. I've never come across such an agreement. You may have done. And also if the project manager makes an assessment. So we saw what that was last week, where project manager decides that it doesn't accept the quote for a compensation event that's been submitted by the contractor, so it'll make its own assessment, usually a reduced amount of money and or period of time if time's included. Now, bear in mind with those two bullet points, the two last bullet points, that under NEC 4, there've been changes. So those options, sorry, the middle option isn't available now under NEC 4. Under NEC 4 now, if you're on options C, D or E, the only schedule available to you is the schedule of the schedule of cost components, not the shorter schedule. Next slide, please. And we're gonna come on later just to explain how NEC 4 has changed in regard to the two schedules later on. So still kind of circling around the schedules, and I want to look at how the contract data is relevant to them. So we've got contract data part 1 completed by the client typically, so effectively the paying party. In a subcontractor, it's the contractor who completes it, and then we have the contract data part 2 completed by the party carrying out the work. So the clue is there. Hopefully you'll realise immediately if it's been completed by the party carrying out the work, it will predominantly include payment information, and that is absolutely the case. So there are 4 elements in the contract data part 2. And again, bear in mind, we're talking about NEC 3 here. So the first one is the schedule, the shorter schedule of cost components for options A and B, because we know that that's what applies for A and B for the compensation events. Then there's the data to complete for the schedule of cost components if you're on options C, D or E. There's also design data for both, whether you're on options A and B or whether you're on options C, D and E. And then there's also the data where you're on options C, D and E, but if you remember the last slide, you've got the option to agree to use the shorter schedule, so there's data to include in there. So effectively, if you look at those 4 indented bullet points, if you're on options A or B, you're going to be filling in that first indented bullet point and the third one. If you're on options C, D or E, you're going to be filling in the second, third and fourth indented bullet points. So it's important that you logically work out which bits you need to fill in and that you fill all of them in. There are lots of blanks for pounds with pound signs, so amounts of money to be included, and also percentages, and also in some cases references to third-party price lists, for example. So please complete it in full. I think I quite often refer to this. I once had a client who only filled its name in the schedule of the contract data part 2. None of the blank spaces for pound signs, price lists, etc., etc. It does raise a serious issue that actually it makes the schedule of cost components and the shorter schedule pretty much inoperable. And there is a real risk. We managed to settle our matter, so there's no case law to say what would happen, but there's a real risk that actually you're not entitled to anything where there's a blank on the contract data part 2. Final bullet point here, just be careful coming back to that point, because we've got a sort of coverall, which is the fee percentage at clause 52.1, which says that if there's something you can't recover from either of whichever schedule applies, then the contract deems that it's covered within the fee percentage. So the fee percentage, typically we think of it as overhead and profit, specifically includes a number of other things. But this is the clause that is not helpful to contractors and subcontractors. What we would prefer it to say, if it was going to help subcontractors and contractors, would be to say, well, the fee percentage covers a certain number of certain items, overhead, profit, and maybe 2 or 3 others. But for anything else that isn't covered in that fee percentage or in the schedule of cost components, contractor, subcontractor gets paid its reasonable cost, for example, but there's nothing in NEC that says that. In fact, it's the opposite, because the default position is if it's not covered in the schedule of cost components, then it's deemed included in the fee percentage. Next slide, please. So we're kind of still circling the schedule of cost components, but this is kind of high level. What are the items that it covers, or what are the headings? So there's 7 different sections in both, so the schedule and the shorter schedule. Slightly different for NEC 4, because as I've already mentioned, NEC 4 includes an extra section for subcontractors, because that's been removed from the definition of defined cost and moved into the schedule of cost components. But for NEC 3, we've got 7 sections set out in these bullet points. The first one is people. in the working areas. So that's typically the site and possibly an extended period if, say, the site cabins are in a different area. Some people will include their own, some subcontractors will include their own office, head office, various other offices as working areas, and we'll see why that might be the case later, but it relates to the fact that you can claim for those people. Equipment, that's the kind of cranes, the kind of the machinery that assists in the construction. Plant and materials, so they're the bricks and mortar, that's the substance that goes into the build. And then we've got a sort of miscellaneous section, which is called charges. So it's kind of third-party costs, consumables, as it says there. So third-party cost you may pay to a local authority, any fees. Consumables includes your fuel supplies, some small tools, the content pretty much of your site cabins, things like that. So what would typically be small or relatively small costs on a project. Then we've got manufacture and fabrication. Now that's off-site manufacture and fabrication. Ditto for design. And then finally, we've got insurance. Pretty much erase the insurance element from your mind. Do not be thinking that this is premiums that, or cost of obtaining insurance. It is not. It's to do with a situation where an insurance claim is made and the insurers make a payment on that claim. So it's quite niche. So do not please think that it's going to assist you recovering any insurance costs or premiums that you have to pay. That is covered within that fee percentage. So you need to factor that into the percentage and make sure the percentage covers it as well as overheads, as well as profits. Next slide, please. So yeah, so this is following on from this. We've already kind of covered all of this. So third bullet point. So we're talking about this fee percentage. So as well as overhead and profit, it also includes things like insurance. So we've already mentioned that, recruitment costs, finance charges, and guarantees. The final bullet point, we've already mentioned this as well. So contractors, so this sort of highlights the fact that the schedule and shorter schedule are looking at what something costs the contractor. So the contractor is entitled to recover the cost of various items, various people, etc., etc. So logically, and then the profit element that businesses, all need to make, is covered in the fee percentage. So therefore, this statement here that contractors have to pass to the employer the benefit of any discounts they obtain is entirely logical, because the benefit of the discount is sort of an extra bonus, a benefit that the contractor will get for bulk buying or whatever. So it just means that that the contractor's not entitled to keep that. Next slide, please. Now, just if you were attending the webinar last month, you'll know all about this, but just to focus on compensation events, which is where the schedules are relevant for option contracts A and B. What we're looking at here is increases in prices, extensions to the completion date, and also the delay. So there's the three elements which are dealt with separately in JCT: extra work, extension of time, and loss and expense cost relating to that extension of time are all covered within a compensation event. Second bullet point is a quote from the NEC guidance notes. And it's quite a nice one if you want to quote it to a project manager or paying party, where, you know, the compensation event cost based on the schedule of cost components is being disputed for any element. And what it is the engineering and construction contract is designed to ensure that the contractor will be unaffected financially. So critically, whilst it's basically saying that the contractor applies to subcontractors shouldn't be worse off for having, you know, had to carry out compensation event work. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Jen. So these are the 7 headings. We've already been through them very quickly, but these are the 7 headings in the NEC 3 schedule and shorter schedules. Obviously, we've already mentioned, but there's an extra heading in NEC 4 for subcontractors. So what we're going to do, if we can just move to the next slide, is to run through each of them and explain sort of quite high level, but also in detail, so a bit contradictory there, what they all cover, and the differences between the schedule and the shorter schedule on a practical level in terms of how it differs. So the one point to note is that both the schedule and the shorter schedule states, this is the middle bullet point here, that you can only claim an amount under one category. So we'll see how that works. We've got an example of that. And also that final bullet point, that as regards the contract and the NEC subcontract, the schedule and the shorter schedule are both substantially the same within the contract and the subcontract. So if you predominantly work under subcontracts, what we're going to cover here with regard to the contract applies equally to the subcontract. So if we can have the next slide, please, Jen. So that first heading, number 1, is people. So this is basically under NEC 3 and 4. What we're talking about is the people engaged by the contractor in a contract or the subcontractor in a subcontract. Any party who has subcontractors, they will be dealt with under NEC as separately under the defined cost definition. Under NEC 4, it's dealt with under the separate heading for subcontractors. So we're just looking at, if we're talking about a contract, we're looking at the contractors, employees, agency staff, and yeah, so the agency staff typically will be, you know, under a sort of a corporate individual companies. So first of all, how does the shorter schedule and the schedule differ? Shorter schedule is slightly briefer. So if we look at that second bullet point, the schedule of cost components allows to cover the cost of employees paid by the contractor in working areas. And then it says with far greater detail as to what's included. So there are 2 key points here. The cost of employees, so that's the far greater detail in the schedule as opposed to the shorter schedule. So the great long list, fundamentally it includes the cost of employees, so what they're paid. It obviously includes the tax that is paid, PAYE, on their behalf. So that's income tax, national insurance, but it also includes those extras, cost of health insurance, cost of company car, cost of their accommodation if they're working away. So there's a whole list of items, the cost of them being on holiday, kind of netted out over the course of the project. So there's a whole raft of things that cover the cost of employing somebody. but it's not the cost of all employees. It's the cost of employees who are working in the working areas. So you need to think about what your working area is on a particular project. So we've also already talked about it being the site. Sometimes it's extended. If, say, site cabins are included outside the site, or if there are other areas, sometimes contractors and subcontractors include their own offices so that, you know, they can have people working on the project in their own offices and it's counted as working area. If we move on to the next bullet point down, so I'm going to come back to the first bullet point. The third bullet point, both the schedule and the shorter schedule includes employees of contractor or subcontractor whose normal place of work is within the working areas, but for whatever reason, they may be working somewhere else for a particular period of time. Now, you might say, well, what's your normal place of work? There's no case law on that. I suspect it's got to be over 50% of the time, and probably it's got to be working predominantly, you know, within that working area. And final bullet point applies to both schedule and shorter schedule. It also includes the employees who are actually working in the working area, even if it's not their normal place of work. So if somebody comes to site and does some work, well, their cost can be included within the defined cost. So it's all a little bit prescriptive, and you just need, the key thing is to be careful about that working area definition. So going back to that first bullet point, the shorter schedule covers the cost of people. So very, very similar to the schedule itself, but the lists of payments, so, you know, the holiday payments, etc., that we talked about for the ordinary schedule is more limited for the shorter schedule. Probably, you know, logically so, because of course, if you're using the shorter schedule, it's in limited circumstances. It's usually going to be for compensation events for options A and B, i.e. your fixed price contract. So if we could have the next slide, please. So people continued in each of the schedules. So that first bullet point is just the point we've been talking about defining your working area, and the working area is defined in the contract data. So, you know, you do have the opportunity to negotiate that. So second bullet point down, the schedule of cost components. These are just some of the items that are are referred to as costs you can include for the cost of employing people. So one is working in special circumstances. So that might include, you know, working at height, shift allowances, food allowances, etc. In both, overtime costs are covered. And again, you know, what you see is a sort of series of checks and balances. So overtime is covered, but the balance is, or the check is, that it's only payable if the work couldn't have been completed by other employees on ordinary rates. So that's to stop a situation where contractor decides, okay, well, we can leave some people, you know, working on a kind of slow because the work isn't on the critical path, but, you know, we'll get other people working overtime on work that is a critical path. So it's designed to ensure that contractor, subcontractor is working in a reasonable way, but also in a very cost efficient way. And it also both includes third-party labour cost, providing it's costed at either open market or competitively tendered rates. So next slide, please, Jen. So Next item, so this is number 2 on the list for the schedule of cost components, and the shorter schedule is equipment. So as we've seen already, this is first of all, it's defined term under NEC. So not all of these items are defined terms. So it's pretty much defined as the equipment that's used to provide the work. So, you know, I've used the analogy of the crane, and you know, you'll see why later. So it includes the cost of the accommodation, and this kind of refers back to what I said about the charges item, because some of what we might think of as equipment, so computers, all that kind of stuff that goes in your site cabin, hand tools, all those kind of smaller items are included in the charges section rather than the equipment section. I mean, personally, I think the key is, as long as you're not double claiming it, that's the most important thing. However, I do know that some project managers are very, very rigid about this. So if you claim it under equipment and it should be under charges, they'll delete it. So they'll certify it as nil, which means then, you know, you've got to wait till the next application for payment before you claim it. You just need to be careful about that. Next slide, please. So in terms of the shorter schedule for the equipment, so this is the kind of, I suppose this is the important bit, in that it's talking about potentially big pieces of equipment, whereas the charges element, hopefully, you know, will be small pieces, so small, you know, small sums of money involved. So what you're entitled to claim? Well, the equipment is payable at the rates listed in the contract data. So this is where, you know, where we say there's an interlink between the contract data and the schedule of components. So therefore, what you are entitled to be paid. So typically, for seeker companies, you might say that the seeker rates apply, so that all rates for equipment, all you do is you look at seeker rates and charge them. If it's not in the published list, then the second bullet point applies, and this is a cover-all. So any other equipment that's not in, you know, the rates that are stated as being published rates is priced at a competitively tendered or open market rate. So that's all good and reasonable in a way, in that you know that under the shorter schedule, so predominantly looking at compensation events for options A and B, you're going to get paid one way or another. You obviously need to make sure that when you're hiring your equipment, you're not paying above market rates, but you know, that would be really surprising if you were. So that's the shorter schedule. So if we can move on to the next slide, which covers the schedule. So of course, this is predominantly contract options C, D, and E. More important to an extent, because this is what you're going to be paid on a monthly basis for providing the work generally. So what are you allowed to recover? Well, you're allowed to recover what you have paid in terms of hire or rental for specific equipment, which would be the norm, assuming, you know, as a business, you don't own that equipment. Now, there's a caveat here, in that if you hire or rent the equipment from a parent company or sister company, you don't get paid those rates unless it's open or market rate. And ditto, you know, if it's your own equipment as well. So the next slide, and yeah, next slide, please. And that's again part of these checks and balances to avoid paying something where, for example, a rate, you know, might be charged by a parent company at a really high rate, knowing that the contract says, well, it's whatever rate is paid. that's payable in the schedule. So that's to avoid that situation, part of this checks and balances. And it gets a little bit detailed here. So again, we're still on the schedule of cost components. So for options C, D and E predominantly. The first bullet point, I suspect, is for a fairly limited scenario where contractor or subcontractor has purchased a specific piece of equipment specifically for a project. And effectively, it's quite convoluted, but effectively what happens here is the piece of equipment is used during the project and a calculation is done to work out the amount it has depreciated in value, and that is what is paid for that piece of equipment. And the logic, I guess, is you buy a piece of equipment for a project, you use it for the project, and then you have the ability to sell it. So your loss or the cost to your business of using that piece of equipment is effectively what you paid for it, less what you can recover by selling it second hand once you've finished using it. Also, second bullet point relates to special equipment. So this would include items that aren't included in any lists in the contract data. And there's a part of the contract data that allows you to list special equipment and what would presumably be special rates for circumstances where that special equipment is used. Note here, and the same applies to the point we've just been talking about, equipment purchase specifically for a project. If the information isn't in the contract data to cover these, then you're not entitled to any payment. So these are really tricky clauses. You're not entitled to any payment unless the project manager agrees through the project. Now, you know, if this was my contract, if I were the contractor or subcontractor, I wouldn't want to be relying on project manager being generous. So, you know, it really needs to be included in the contract data. They're quite onerous clauses, those. Next slide, please. So I think this is a final one on equipment. So this is a sort of what I would call miscellaneous kind of sweep up to make sure that all of that cost, so we're looking at, if you remember, actual cost is covered. So equipment that is consumed is covered, so you can recover the cost of your petrol, etc. Also these sort of miscellaneous costs, which might in some cases be quite high. So the cost of transporting equipment to site, to working areas, cost of erecting it, dismantling it, they're all claimable and payable, unless, of course, they're already included and have been claimed for in the hire or rental rate. So, of course, you know, that would effectively be double counting. We know double counting is not allowed. And also the cost of operatives. So, I think we've got the crane scenario covered somewhere. So we know that the crane is equipment. You might have a crane driver who technically would be under the people section, unless the crane driver and the crane come as a package. So it's all as a hire for a fixed price. In that case, you can't claim the cost of the crane driver in the people section. Again, it's checks and balances, but that you can't have double counting. The key is, so that's the first principle, but it goes back to the second point is, you know, you need to try and claim it under the correct category from the first point. Otherwise, you might find your PM scrubs the claim out first interim payment application and leaves it to you to reclaim it in the following interim payment application in the following month, which potentially creates a cash flow problem in the meantime. Next slide, please. So we're on to plant and materials. So this is the third item in the schedules. Again, it's defined, so it's a defined term in the contract. So it's the the items that are included in the works, so the bricks and the mortar. It's the stuff that you're not going to remove and take back with you and send back to the hire company or back to your site, your premises, when you finish the project. So quite nicely, the schedule and the shorter schedule are identical in this section. One thing you need to note, so just a relatively small point, it doesn't cover the cost of procurement. So if you're going to have to go through a procurement exercise, you'll need to amend the contract with a Z clause or some extra contract data to make sure that cost of procurement's covered one way or another. So the next slide, please. So this is quite similar to the equipment. In that it includes the ability to claim for the cost of delivering plant and materials to site, to working areas, and removing them if there's been an over order. It also covers providing and removing packaging, also sampling and testing for plant and materials. So, you know, this is where it kind of brings home that, you know, it is quite detailed and quite specific what you can claim. And if you remember, it is specific, and, you know, that rule that if it's not covered in the schedule that you're using, the shorter schedule or the ordinary schedule, whichever's relevant, then it's deemed to be included within your fee. You know, you need to be aware of what's covered so that if you have an unusual project, you know, you need to potentially amend to cover anything that is an unusual cost. So the next 3 bullet points are just designed at encouraging the contractor not to over order, but also not to under order. So to try to get the right amount of materials first time, but to an extent, anything that needs to be returned, you know, that's not paid to the contractor because it's presumably it's refunded, but equally the cost of returning it is covered and is coverable, is claimable within both schedules. So next slide, please. So onto these charges, the miscellaneous costs, third-party costs, whatever you want to call them. Now, charges, it's not defined under NEC. It's as we've said, it's sort of a mixture. So it's third-party costs, it's consumables, and it's those sort of small equipment costs. So it includes your water, your gas, electricity. Now that's calculated as a percentage for both the for the shorter schedule, which is where the contract data part 2 comes in, because the percentage needs to be included in in the contract data part 2 by the party who's going to be paid for it, so the contractor or the subcontractor, and also includes payments to public authorities, as we've already mentioned. If we can move to the next slide, please. So you might be thinking on this, the bracketed items, these are, if you look at the SCC, schedule of cost components, obviously, and SS, shorter schedule. So 43 and 42, that's just the numbered referencing. In the engineering and construction contract, the subcontract will be the same. So it's just the numbering reference in there. It's like a clause number effectively. So what else do the charges include for if a compensation event is cancelled? This is where the payment is covered off. It includes things like inspection certificates, charges for others to visit site, others don't include the contractors, other people. It includes people where charges are made, say other people engaged by the client, the employer, or others also includes statutory authorities, etc. It includes consumables and equipment, so we've already seen that, and some specialist services. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So other charges which cover elements of equipment. So these are effectively, I would say, they're small elements of equipment. So it says here, so it excludes accommodation. So site accommodation is fairly and squarely in equipment, but catering comes within the charges, security comes within charges, copying, all that kind of stuff that goes within the site cabins typically comes within charges, and also hand tools. So it's like a real mishmash of items. We also have the percentages. So we've already referred to this. Depending on whether you're using the schedule or the shorter schedule, the percentage is wider for the shorter schedule. It includes more items. But it's basically, so what's it a percentage of? Well, it's the percentage figure will be in the contract data part 2. So contractor, subcontractor needs to complete that, and it's a percentage of the people cost. So if, for example, you have a particular compensation event, you calculate the cost of your people, the first item we looked at, and then you apply whatever the percentage is to work out the cost of some of the charges. So things like, typically it's things like the consumables, the gas, the electric, etc., and some other bits and pieces. As far as the percentages go, the shorter schedule has a wider scope than the ordinary schedule. So, for example, that one includes water, gas, electricity, etc. So if we can have the next slide, please. So moving on to manufacturing and fabrication, I'm going to skim through this because it's probably not too relevant to you. First of all, it's not defined what manufacture and fabrication is in the contract, but it's manufacture and fabrication that takes place outside the working area. So I think it's probably quite limited for your work, unless you know, you're working on a huge facility, rather than you know, doing grounds and, you know, usual civil engineering work. It's relatively simple in that the contractor recovers the sums paid for the offsite manufacture and fabrication. But of course, that's not going to cover any overhead, profit, etc. So again, in the contract data part 2, contractors, subcontractors need to include a percentage, and it's a percentage of the cost of whatever has been manufactured or fabricated, to cover the overhead and profit, effectively the percentage. Next slide, please. So this is design, very similar to the manufacture and fabrication, in that it's not defined in NEC, and also it applies only outside the working area, so it's off-site design. In this regard, the schedule of cost components and the shorter schedule are identical. It's sort of as you would expect. So if you imagine kind of designer working in a consultant's office, you know, how do they calculate the costs? Well, on the basis of the time spent designing, you know, at their hourly rates, So in this case, the hourly rates, there's a part in the contract data part 2 to include designers' hourly rates. So all it is number of hours times hourly rates. So they just need to keep a record of hourly rates spent on a particular item. So that covers the cost for that individual for their work. There's also an overhead and potentially profit calculation. And again, it's a percentage, and it's a percentage of the sum claimed for the individual designers. And then in addition, the cost of travel, wherever there's any travel required, is added on. So that's design. Next slide, please. I think this is insurance. So I'm just going to skim over this totally because we've already covered that. But just please bear in mind, it's not the cost of your premiums. It's where insurance is paid out. Next slide, please. So some of the problems, and some of these have sort of been in part being covered by NEC4, which is the last section. So if you're having to prove what each individual person in your organisation or on site costs, you know, you're going to have to provide a lot of documentation, not just wage slips, probably. And of course, you know, the penultimate bullet point also applies here that, you know, we're not talking about average rates for operatives, you know, so, you know, we pay, you know, our labourers between X and Y pounds per hour or per year. What we're talking about is, well, we've got 3 individual labourers on site, you know, one is paid X, one is paid Y, and one is paid Z. Right, we need to prove, you know, what each is paid and the cost to us. So one, you know, might have health insurance, the others might not. You need to show all that information, which must be quite tedious for everyone. It's always problematic proving the cost of self-employed people. And also this third sub-bullet point, the records of what operatives are doing and how long it's taken them is really problematic. And that kind of parting comes in part goes back to last week when we looked at the fact that irrespective of providing quotes for compensation event work, the case law shows that if you need to go to adjudication or court, you need to actually prove what your actual cost is rather than the forecast cost. So you're going to have to show how long somebody spent on that compensation event work and what exactly they were doing. So, you know, that's problematic in lots and lots of respects. Include, you know, CE work, but also general work if you're carrying it out under options C, D, and E, because you need to show that, you know, well, we spent 3 hours doing, you know, whatever task it was, whether it was a CE work or not, and you know, that's a reasonable period to spend on work of that type. Next slide, please. The equipment, similar issues. There's always problems. Employers, paying parties quite often don't like the seeker rates because the argument is that they're higher than market rates. But, you know, obviously far easier to have a schedule of rates than have to actually prove actual cost, actual higher rates for each project, because, you know, there are going to be just so many invoices involved. And I should think it's a logistical problem for contractors showing, well, you know, this invoice for the hire of this equipment related to this particular project. So it's basically all around invoicing. The final bullet point, you know, questioning productivity of equipment. You know, was it being fully productive, or, you know, could the work have been done quicker or more efficiently? But to be frank, I mean, that is just a general challenge that we have, improving, entitlement to sums, whether it's an NEC contract or JCT. We're always going to come across those arguments. Next slide, please. Yeah, plant and materials, exactly the same point. So if we can have the next slide. Just very quickly, NEC4, got 2 new compensation events, but don't get too excited because they're not exciting. The first one is a very discrete situation, which we kind of touched upon last month, where the project manager can ask a contractor, or a subcontractor can be asked to provide a quote for a proposed instruction. So it's not an instruction to do work, it's a proposed instruction. It's a client might want this doing, can you submit a quote so we can see how much it'll cost? So it's the one exception to the rule that contractor just carries out the work. This isn't an instruction to carry out work, it's an instruction to just provide a quote. Now, if PM then says, well, thanks for that quote, but we're not going to proceed, this CE allows the contractor to price and be paid for the cost of providing that quote. So it's quite discreet, and it's not, I mean, I wouldn't imagine that it's going to be huge money, even if it's for a big item, 2 or 3 days for a QS to provide a quote, even for a big item, is not going to amount to huge claims. And then the last one, this 60.121, is just any additional CEs can now be included in the contract data part 1. It can also be included in the Z clauses. So, whether or not that's helpful, I'll leave you to judge. Next slide, please. So what we're going to look at now, just very quickly, is how NEC4 differs from what we've seen the schedules cover in NEC3. So the big change for options C, D and E is what we've already talked about, in that there's no option to now to use the shorter schedule if both parties decide they would like to. And in my experience, it's never been used anyway. So that's been removed. I think it simplifies it. The next item that we have is that so this is for the charges, where we were looking at some of the items having percentage figures, so you didn't have to cost them. So we said the percentages apply to different items, whether you're looking at the shorter schedule or the schedule. The shorter schedule in particular applied a percentage to cover the electricity, the fuel supplied, etc. And that's been removed. I don't think it's particularly helpful, because it now means contractors and subcontractors have got to provide evidence of actual cost for all these little bits and pieces. But that's where we are. Also, what's been removed is the subcontractor fee, and that's because when we look at the added bit, if we can have the next slide, Jen, please, and as I've already mentioned, the subcontractor section, so it's the first sub-bullet point on this slide, subcontractor section has been added, a whole new section into both the schedule and the shorter schedule. It's really nice and clear, and I think that's a really good change. It's not meaning that previously under NEC3 you can't claim for your subcontractors because they're covered under the definition of defined cost. It just means that if somebody's new to NEC, they look at either of the schedules of cost components, and they can clearly see that subcontractors are included, whereas previously you would look at it and think, well, I can't see any reference to subcontractors, so how do we claim for them? And it means the follow-on from that is this second bullet point down, so the defined cost, rather than it being a little bit convoluted where it referred to the schedules of cost components and also covered off the subcontractor costs, the defined cost definition is now quite simple. It's basically, see schedule of cost components. So, I like simple, so it works for me. Third bullet point down, another good change in my view is for the shorter schedule of cost components only, we now have people rates. So bear in mind, this is just going to be for compensation events. But there's a section in the contract data part 2 that allows you to set out the people, so the disciplines of people and what rates you are going to be paid for them. So that is really good. It avoids all this convoluted process of having to show how much individuals cost the contractor or the subcontractor. But beware, because once you have a rate in situations where you have high inflation, it means that, in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, when you're still working on the project, that rate, may not be realistic anymore. So, just bear that in mind. Be careful of missing a category. So I would tend to put, a sort of caveat, if we've missed anybody, then, a reasonable rate is payable, or, what we actually, the cost, something, that covers people who might be missed. So I think that's really good. In my experience, contractors, subcontractors doing work on those options A and B often do that in NEC3 in any event. So I think if we can have the next slide, please, Jen. I'm pretty sure that's everything. Yes, that's everything for today. So happy to deal with any questions. I've noticed I don't think my email address is on the slides. But as always, if you think of anything and want to drop me a line, if you look at our website, Bevan Britton website, you'll find my email address. So, drop me an email. Just wondering if we have got any questions, Jan.
We do have some questions today. I am conscious that it is now 6 minutes past 2. So if you're okay to take the questions, Sarah, then I'm more than happy to ask them on people's behalf. Yeah. But for anybody who does need to drop off, then this part of the recording will also be uploaded to the YouTube channel. So if anybody does have any other meetings to attend, then you will still be able to go back and listen to the answers. But does it work for you, Sarah, if we go through these questions now? So the first question that came in was from Christopher Coburn. I think you would pronounce his surname, so apologies if I've mispronounced that, Christopher. Does working areas also now cover people's homes due to working from home now?
Not specifically. So you've still got to come within that criteria. So you're looking at a situation where you've either got to be able to say that their usual place of work is the working area. So they would normally be working on site, assuming that on site is the defined working area. Excuse me, and they just happen to be working at home for this particular part of the work, or you need to ensure that it's included within the definition of working area.
Thank you. And then the next question is from Daniel Scott. Is there only one fee percentage which can be applied to manufacture and fabrication off-site under NEC4?
I think so, yes. I don't think it's changed. So it's effectively just to cover the sort of overhead and profit element, I think, for that manufacture. So yes, I think there is just 1%.
Thank you. The next question from Callum Smith. If the people rates include for things such as hotels, how does that work for variations where this is not critical path delay, so there's no extra hotel nights required? Or is this simply to the contractor's benefit?
you read that again?
Yeah. If the
Sorry,
people,
can we just hold that thought, Jen? Can I just go back to that previous question about percentages?
yeah,
We were talking about the percentage on the offsite manufacture and the design. So don't forget that whilst you can claim that percentage that we talked about specifically, but when you've got your total of all those elements that we looked at in the schedule of cost components, you can still add your fee percentage on, so your contractors overhead profit, and as we saw, insurance, recruitment fees, etc., etc. So don't forget about that. So sorry, can you just read that question out again about the
yeah, that's
hotels?
fine. So if the people rates include for things such as hotels, how does this work for variations where this is not critical path delay, so thus no extra hotel nights required? Or is this simply to the contractor's benefit?
Oh, right. Let me work my way through that. So if you're on options A and B, you're on a fixed price contract. So you're not claiming, if there are no compensation events, you're not claiming for anyone's hotel fees. It's all included in the fixed price. If you have a compensation event, you then claim for the cost of that compensation event. So it might be extra work, and there may or may not be some critical delay attached to it. It's got to be critical delay though, so it's got to be delay that extends the completion date. So if it's critical delay, you get your extension of time and you get your cost associated with it. So if that means that you've got people staying in hotels and they have to stay on longer as a result, then that's claimable. If, on the other hand, somebody started on site, their work was finished, they weren't involved in the critical delay, so they've left, they're finished, then obviously there's no cost to claim, they're not still staying in the hotel. So that's A and B. If you're on C, D and E, then I guess what's going to happen there is you claim all those costs, but if you get to the stage where you're in delay, and I mean, if it's been delay caused by the client, then the same scenario as above applies. If it's delay caused by the contractor, then it would be reduced. You wouldn't get your hotel costs because the employer would be saying, well, actually, that's contractor's default, so you wouldn't be entitled to it. Hope that helps.
I hope so. I hope this. I'm glad you're the one answering the questions. That's all I can say, Sarah. So just a couple more questions. So the next one is from Shelton Chan. So if based on the ecological walkover after the contractor engaged into the site, protected species are likely to be existing, which means more cost and time implications happen. So, for example, badger sets discovered and some other ecologists to visit and prepare a report.
Yeah.
Will there be any potential to cover the cost and EOT?
So I'm assuming that the walkover's taking place after we've signed the contract. If we haven't signed the contract, then don't sign it. Let's try and renegotiate it. If we have signed the contract, I think you'd be trying. I mean, this is more about, is it a compensation event? Who takes the risk? And it sort of partly depends on what's in the works information and the site information. If it was reasonably anticipated, so I think you'd probably be trying to say the site isn't, it's a site information claim. It wasn't reasonably anticipated that we would come up with all this, all these issues, all these challenges. So you'd be saying it would be a compensation event under that. Can't think of any other compensation event it would be.
And then the last question, on what basis 3% is defined for overheads?
3%.
Yes.
I mean, there's no set rule for what overheads would be. I mean, there might be some economic, rule that says, business overheads are 3%. I can't answer that. I don't know. And I must say, I mean, the percentages that contractors and subcontractors use, it always surprises me. At one point I started to keep a kind of a log, sad that I am, a log of all the different percentages to see if I could see a pattern. But they seem to vary wildly. But at the end of the day, the fee percentage is to cover overhead, profit, and all those miscellaneous items. So, as a business, each business has got to make its own decision as to, what it needs to charge to make a profit. And I mean, in some instances, a lower percentage might be agreed to win the work, knowing that there's no profit on the project, or you possibly covered the overheads already, so don't need that percentage. So I don't think that's been very helpful, but I can't comment on, is 3% the right percentage for overheads or not, or is that a standard or not?
Yeah, no, that's lovely. Thank you very much, Sarah. As you can see, I've just added my email address into the chat. So if anybody does want any more clarity or has any more questions, then please feel free to email me, and then we could always, well, if you don't mind me, Sarah, then I can contact you and get some more information. But thank you so much for that. Just to remind everybody about next month's webinar, it's a month today, is the webinar 1 o'clock on Tuesday the 21st of March, and that's NEC case law. Or if you prefer, there's going to be a face-to-face seminar on the Thursday that week, which is Thursday the 23rd of March, and that's going to be a breakfast seminar starting at 8:30, and that's at the Bridge in Walshford. In Wetherby. So if anybody does want to register for any of those events, you can do so by contacting myself. And yeah, lovely. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you for taking the time to answer the questions at the end there. Very useful.
Thanks, Jan.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye now.